You will also see, if you read that website and Fred's biography there, far more lengthy than I can give you today, that he has an eclectic background, to say the least. Ancestors who are indigenous to at least 3 continents, at least 3, maybe more than that. Born in Karlsruhe in Germany, living in Hawaii, as well as Texas and other places. He has been, like me, fascinated by the similarities in the histories of Texas and Hawaii. Some of you may not see that immediately, but if you think about revolutions fought by recently arrived American plantation owners, and if you talk about a republic created which lasts a few years and is then annexed by the United States, in the near context of a war with a Spanish-speaking power, then certainly you can see that Texas annexation and Hawaiian annexation, the Texas Revolution and the Hawaiian Revolution, are perhaps more similar than you ever thought. What Dr. McGhee is going to bring to us today is another perspective on the Texas Revolution, a perspective from abolitionists and from slaves, who were both very interested and vitally interested in what was going on in Texas in the 1830s. And so I offer you the Texas Revolution and Annexation Considered, revisiting the abolitionist thesis. Dr. McGhee.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim. And all of the organizers of this event, thank you very much on behalf of my family for extending an invitation to speak here today. I don't like speaking from behind podiums. Is it okay if I go down here? It's not okay? All right, I guess I better do it from up here. Will this thing move? Oh, boy. All right, well, let me put my bale of cotton right here. Because this is really what it boils down to, ladies and gentlemen, right here. I have a genuine bale of cotton from Taft, Texas, right here. And as you can see here, this is the masthead for The Liberator, the newspaper, founded by the noted Boston-based abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. Let me launch right into it, give you some quotes. Many of you are probably familiar with this quote, and I'm not going to read them to you, obviously. I think you can do that for yourselves. I will be skipping over a lot of information. Much of this information I'm going to be presenting to you today is of a secondary nature, but there is also some primary material here that I'm going to be presenting to you so that you can get an idea of what people like me, more contemporary scholars of Texas enslavement, some of the techniques that we are using. I have, obviously, an archaeological perspective on some of these things as a historical archaeologist, and the field of historical archaeology, which, just to kind of piggyback on the previous speaker, which I think is underappreciated by the Texas Historic Preservation Establishment. By that I mean the field of historical archaeology, as it is actually practiced by many historical archaeologists, using contemporary theoretical tools from historical archaeology. But the point here is that I'm going to be presenting to you a different perspective on this situation, on the Texas Revolution, on Texas, and so on. This is obviously a picture of the monument, and this is a quote from the noted Unitarian minister and quasi-abolitionist William Ellery Channing, who wrote a famous sort of screed along with Lundy, which I'll get to later, Benjamin Lundy. Many of you are probably familiar with Lundy. He was the mentor to William Lloyd Garrison and came to Texas and had firsthand observations of what Texas was at the time. I think it's an interesting quote, and I put it up here because it really, when I read it, made me think of whether the things he said actually have turned out to be true or not. I invite you to read it and make up your own minds. Okay, the title, in terms of reconsideration, I chose it because it's not just about events, but also how those events have been interpreted. The noted Haitian scholar Michel Wolf-Trouillot over here, Silencing the Past, a good book that came out about 12 years ago, in which he talks about two different types of historicities. Historicity one, which he calls what actually took place, the physical event in time, space, that you can say took place. In other words, what some people like to call the facts, okay, are not the same as what people say about those facts. And it's important to draw the distinction. The argument might sound a little anthropological, but the ability to say about something and to name and to define definitely influences your perspective on history. I'll get to this later, and I'll provide a little bit of a more concrete example. The search for the nature of history has led us to deny ambiguity and either to demarcate precisely and at all times the dividing line between historical process and historical knowledge. That's just another way of saying what I just said. History is process, history is knowledge. Or to conflate at all times historical process and historical narrative. When you look at this history, the history of Texas and its revolution, from an African-American perspective, many of the people that are considered heroes don't look like heroes. That probably isn't a surprise to most of you, okay? My job here today is to explain to you why that is and how that is so. And the idea here is to challenge. The idea is to get you to think, to reconsider. I'm going to try to go here beyond the great man thesis of history, okay? Texas, the soil of Texas was walked by giants, this kind of thing, okay? I think we all agree that history is a little more complicated than that. Now, there is a black perspective, a black historical perspective on Texas and indeed world history. And my job is to try to explain what that is. I got this from Manning Marable, the noted Columbia University scholar. And basically the three parts are description, correction, and prediction. There is a vindicationist tradition, which UT program, through its director, Professor Edmund T. Gordon, also uses, and that comes straight through the great black anthropologist St. Clair Drake. And the idea here is that we're looking at presenting black life from the perspective of black people. Okay, that's very important. So as black scholars, our job is to describe what this means, how we see it through our own eyes. And I invite you to try to do that. Correction. That's always a big part of what historical conversations when it comes to these types of historical narratives is about. And then prediction, actually having things to say about where we should go based upon our historical information. When it comes to the issue of slavery, these are some standard source narratives. I put them up here. You're probably familiar with many of them. Obviously, this is Mike Campbell's book here. I'll be citing this book later. This is, of course, the noted African-American scholar, Dr. W.B. Du Bois. And here is some alternate source material on the subject of Texas slavery and Texas history in general. Now, let me get right into it in terms of conventional explanations. The Bugbee explanation is basically that slavery was a factor. This is something that's not been denied, I think, by the fraternity of Texas historians, the role of slavery in the Texas Revolution. The question has always been, well, how much of a factor was it? And in 1898, Bugbee basically was like, okay, it's a factor. Professor Barker has the dull organic ache thesis. I think that's pretty much the best way to describe it. Slavery was this dull organic ache always in the background. But there were other factors, more dominant factors. And this is a quote from a paper that Dr. Barker delivered. You're probably familiar with this quote. It's pretty much set the stage for how a lot of historians have interpreted this history ever since. It's kind of, Barker, people kind of do the ring around the rosy with Barker, sometimes you challenge him, sometimes you don't, but he is sort of, the Papa Franz, the Papa of Texas history. So if you're going to say something about Barker in terms of his historical interpretations, you ought to at least quote what he says first and then try to make your argument. So I'm trying to do that here. Probably the best explanation in terms of summary is Richard Rollins Stenberg's description of the Texas Revolution. Many of you are probably familiar with Stenberg's thesis. He was supervised by Barker in 1930, and Stenberg was one of the Texas so-called conspiracy theorists. His dissertation is called American Imperialism in the Southwest, and he argues strongly that Andrew Jackson, through a variety of techniques, working through Houston, but others as well, basically took Texas for the United States from Mexico. But even Stenberg accepts what was then the regnant thesis, the Barker thesis. It has been shown that the revolution was the outcome of racial incompatibility. Racial incompatibility. This is language that's not used today, obviously. I think in 1932 it was more acceptable to say that. Dislike and distrust between Mexicans and American colonists. Mexico's apprehension of aggressive designs and machinations by the United States, blah, 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 blah. And American settlers had contempt for Mexicans, unduly emphasized by contact with the thriftless Mexicans of Texas, AKA Tejanos. And then we have the more contemporary interpretation, which is essentially a version of this. I think Professor Cantrell accepts still, with some modifications, but not major ones, the Barker dull organic ache thesis. And then we have, of course, the old school Fehrenbach, Dr. Fehrenbach description of the issue. It's interesting that this is also the version of events that is put forth by the revolutionaries themselves. I think that's important to bear in mind, because generally speaking, if you accept, this is true of Julius Caesar as well, actually. Julius Caesar was assassinated by a lot of people. And then their theory, their version of events about why he was assassinated has recently been challenged by Caesarian historians. It's sort of similar in Texas. The version of events that's sort of still dominant is the one that actually was the one that has been talked about from the beginning by the victors. There are, of course, Mexican interpretations of this, and I think we pretty much have an idea of what they are. Terán talked about the role of slavery in Texas in 1828 in his inspection. We know what he said. Well, this is what he said. And of course, Almonte in his famous 1834 inspection pretty much said it was over. I mean, unless drastic measures were taken, Texas was already lost. That was the long and short of what he had to say. But Mexican observers were very clear. And I'm not sort of positing here that these, like for instance, that Terán or even Almonte were abolitionists in the American sense, okay? But nonetheless, I think they had a perspective that is useful to bear in mind. They certainly saw what was happening in Texas and what the Texans were doing to establish slavery. Josefina Zoraida Vázquez talks about the war, the subsequent war after the revolution and the annexation, and pretty much this is the reigning Mexican interpretation of events. Mexican historians have always viewed expansionism as the origin of the war, the Mexican-American War, with the independence and annexation of Texas as the immediate cause, and the North American infiltration into California as an aggravating proposition. For this reason, during the war, Mexicans referred to it as the Texas War. One thing that's usually not discussed when it comes to Texas and events in Texas is the African-American perspective. And there is such a perspective. One of them is an African-American intellectual perspective. The leading 19th century intellectual for black Americans at the time was, of course, Frederick Douglass. This is what Frederick Douglass had to say about events in Texas in a speech that he gave in Ireland. Around this time, Douglass couldn't be in the United States because he had just published his autobiography and was still enslaved and would have been re-enslaved had he stayed in the United States. So he embarked on a speaking tour sponsored by the American Anti-Slavery Society and talked about what his perspective was. Oh, how superlatively base, how mean, how dastardly do the American people appear in the light of justice, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As typical, Douglass had a very strong rhetorical style, but certain things stick out here. One of them is the American role in the taking of Texas from Mexico. That was certainly the impression that the abolitionists had. It was the impression that Douglass, who as an abolitionist, had. In terms of what happened, subsequent events, if you haven't read it yet, I encourage you to read this classic work. And I do cite Lois Bannister Merck, Dr. Merck's wife, who he says he would have put on as a co-author if he had been allowed to do so. So I decided to do it in retrospect. But generally speaking, I think we can agree that the War of 1846, 1848 was an aggressive war by the United States against Mexico. That's something even the History Channel at this point concedes. So what is a modern black interpretation of these events? And you know, if you're going to talk about history and African Americans, it's probably best to cite the leading black historian, which is, of course, Dr. John Hope Franklin. And here's what he says in his book, From Slavery to Freedom. The acquisition of Florida in 1819, the settling of Missouri, and its entrance into the Union as a slave state in 1821, and the movement culminating in the acquisitions of Texas in 1845, were largely the result of the forces that the emergence of the Cotton Kingdom let loose. In 1845, this was what it was about, okay? Certainly in the older, what was then southwestern states, the states that in the earlier part of the 19th century had been brought into the American Union. I'm speaking here, of course, of the states of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, the states where Andrew Jackson engaged in Indian extermination and removal. So this is pretty much the African-American position. And Dr. Du Bois, in his own dissertation, I think really hits the point on the head. Slavery is always going to be a subject that's fraught with morals and morality. But it's important to bear in mind that slavery was about economics. This is a system that would not have worked and would not have survived if it wasn't profitable. So let's do a brief overview. And this is straight lifted from Mike Campbell's book. I'm probably not telling you anything new here in terms of slavery in Texas and how it became established here. Slavery, of course, did exist prior to 1821 in Texas. As a matter of fact, in San Antonio it existed. But it wasn't, there were not a lot of slaves in the American sense in the Spanish Texas. Although there was a considerable amount of Afro-mestizaje that did occur, and that is now just starting to be documented. There were many, many African mixed bloods in Texas prior to Anglo settlement here. But this basically gives you some idea of what enslavement meant demographically in Texas. This is a graph of how quickly the institution grew. As you can see, it grew very rapidly. And the task for contemporary scholars of slavery in Texas is to establish how that happened. And I'll get into that in a minute. I don't want to get ahead of myself. This is a map of the slave trade from Africa to give you some sense of where people were taken from the African continent. As you can see, they were also taken from East Africa and Zanzibar. Zanzibar also, of course, interacted with the Arab slave trade over here in places such as present-day Oman and other Gulf states. Down into Mozambique as well, but you can see here some of the sources of the enslaved population in the United States. This is a picture of the domestic slave trade, and that's really the key to understanding the movement of enslaved people into places like Texas. Louisiana too, but especially Texas, and especially in the 1850s. As you can see here, Galveston was clearly the preferred port, but there was also a great deal of land migration. Matter of fact, it predominated. Texas is kind of interesting in terms of the internal slave trade. Maritime stuff in Texas does play a considerable role, more so than in some other places. But still, the primary way in which enslaved people were brought into Texas was over land, not via sea. You can get an idea here of where the enslaved population was according to the 1850 census. As you can see, it's all obviously concentrated in the eastern portion and in the area here along the Brazos River Valley. This is the 1860 census. And I make a note here, Mike Campbell relied in Empire for Slavery in 1989 on tax rolls and census information. We're now moving beyond that. We're now actually getting into things, and he has too, actually, in some of his more specific articles. But we're starting to look at additional sources of information because tax rolls are notoriously unreliable. And indeed, many of the census records are also not as good as they could be. especially in a place like Texas. Now, in terms of interpretations of slavery, let me talk a little bit about some of that. The conventional interpretation of slavery is basically this. Masters were kind, slaves were not overworked or cruelly beaten, masters did not rape their black women, slave children were not sold from their parents, and slave trading did not separate husband from wife. This is the benevolent paternalist interpretation of slavery. This is, in some ways, still the prevalent thesis of slavery. You hear this a lot. I was amazed to find Texas school books perpetuate this myth. And even recent books, the most recent biography of LBJ by Randall Woods, a noted University of Arkansas professor, still says slavery in Texas was not as bad as in other states. It's funny, you know, if you look at it, almost every state says that about their state. It's pretty interesting. Now, the abolitionist version of this is, of course, this version. This version of slavery emphasizes its strongly commercial character, including the buying and selling of slaves, recognizes the essential humanity of the enslaved, and condemns slavery as morally evil, and castigates the historical profession for whitewashing the actual history of enslavement and Reconstruction. It also bemoans the white South's repeated treatment of slavery with tender tears, with false memorials, lying books, and racist films such as The Birth of a Nation. Why slavery? Well, I'll give you some example from Adam Rothman's excellent book, Slave Country, just published a couple of years ago. And this Slave Country, by the way, is a book about the Southwest. The Southwest being defined not as Texas, but the states that I mentioned earlier, the American Southwest in the earlier part of the 19th century, the states that would become Georgia to Mississippi and parts of Louisiana. But basically what he's talking about here is the benevolent paternalist myth that planters employed and that persists to the present, just in different forms. James Wilkinson, a noted sugar and cotton planter, pretty much explained. He said slavery was a curse, but they couldn't help themselves, basically. Okay? Slave owners argued that people of African descent were better suited for hard labor in the southern climate than were white people. This racist label, this is supposed to be label, not libel, masked a deeper truth about power. Free people demanded exorbitant wages, resented close supervision, and struck off on their own as soon as they were able. Matter of fact, that is how much of Texas was settled. Whatever their national origin or racial designation, free people chafed at working in other people's fields, and they could avail themselves of local, regional, and national resources, especially access to land, to fend off exploitation. Slaves, in contrast, lacked these resources, and as a result, they could be forced to labor under the most severe climactic and epidemiological conditions. Slaves could be forced to perform tasks that free people would not accept and had the capacity to refuse. The disrupted character of their communal networks and their exclusion from the political, quote, people rendered them exploitable. This is the cover of the book, by the way. And this is, is anybody here familiar with this book? Has anybody read this book? Is Professor Daly here? Okay, he isn't. But this is a book, Carry Me Back, the Domestic Slave Trade, a recent book on the domestic slave trade in America, following the work of Michael Tadman, the pioneer of research on the domestic slave trade in the United States. You can read this here. I'm not going to belabor it because there's so much more to cover. The Mask of Malevolence. I'll let you all read this, but basically, this is the heart of the benevolent paternalist myth. This is the idea that slaves are part of the family. You see this over and over when you look at the personal correspondence, including notes in the margins of people's Bible. Okay? Missy, my beloved slave. Okay? You see it over and over. And unfortunately, it's something that is a fiction. Laws banning the importation and interstate transfer of slaves continued the evolution of pro-slavery doctrine by drawing a line between slave trading and slave holding. That line originated as a useful fiction written by planters in the Upper South during the Revolutionary era. They contrasted the vicious commercial world of the Atlantic slave trade, which was dominated by British merchants, with the more virtuous agrarian world of the American plantation. Implicit in the contrast were the rudiments of a patriarchal defense of slavery. Slave owners increasingly argued that their slaves were an integral part of their household, even families, and were bound to them by ligaments of mutual obligation and affection. The patriarchal perspective held that enslaved people were obliged to labor for and submit to their owners in return for their owners' protection and care. A slaveholder was entitled, even required, to punish his slaves for disobedience or poor performance, but he could not treat them sadistically or neglectfully without endangering the peace of the community or risking his honor. This is one of the best modern descriptions of the paternalist ideal that I've read. That's why I quoted it. Solomon Northup is a famous enslaved person. There's many slave narratives out there, including the famous WPA narratives. This is a wonderful narrative if you haven't read it yet. Northup was a New Yorker who was a free black man who was brought to Louisiana and the border between Louisiana and Texas, and was enslaved for over a decade, and then ended up writing this book, 12 Years a Slave. My narrative is at an end. I have no comments to make upon the subject of slavery. Those who read this book may form their own opinions of the, quote, peculiar institution. What it may be in other states, I do not profess to know. What it is in the region of Red River is truly and faithfully delineated in these pages. This is no fiction, no exaggeration. A kidnapped free black in Texas and Louisiana. Now, what are some of the consequences for African Americans of the Texas Revolution? We know the standard version. Let me give you the alternative version. The presence of, and this is, I'm going to focus here on free blacks, because of course there were free blacks in Texas, some of whom fought with the Texans. Neither slaves nor true citizens, they largely occupied an ambiguous social position and had to fight for what rights they could. After independence, people of black descent were not recognized as part of the Mexican population, who had the right to become citizens of the new republic. And then, of course, there were some laws passed. We know about the Constitution of Texas and the amendments, the various amendments that had to be undertaken to allow free blacks to remain in Texas. The famous Ashworth Law, which refers to Aaron Ashworth. Many of these free blacks were of like 1/8 or 1/16 black blood, but of course, given the one-drop rule, they were black. I mean, they could have been 1/256th black. They would have been black. Other free blacks, such as Greenberry Logan and so forth, stayed in Texas thanks to the actual acts of the Congress of Texas, although they were subject to increasingly vicious forms of racism and jealousy over time. There were many free blacks. The long and short of this is that free blacks lost their land. I mean, that's really what it boils down to. Now let me get into the abolitionist case. This is Benjamin Lundy's famous 1836 tract. The War in Texas, a review of facts and circumstances showing that the contest is the result of a long, premeditated crusade against the government, set on foot by slaveholders, land speculators, etc., with the view of reestablishing, extending, and perpetuating the system of slavery in the slave trade in the Republic of Mexico by a citizen of the United States. Okay. I mean, this is a typical pamphlet for the time. Let's talk about some of the things that Lundy said. Merton Dillon is Lundy's biographer. And here's what he summarized Lundy's argument and position to basically be. He felt no sympathy for the Texas rebels. This is Lundy. In his view, Mexico had granted the American immigrants the most liberal of concessions. Probably true. The Mexican government was positively munificent in the amount of land it was handing out. I mean, it was like an open spigot. It was like Niagara Falls. All you had to essentially do is show up and you could get land. Their legitimate grievances were few and trivial, yet they remained ungrateful for these favors and plotted rebellion against fancied oppression. Americans had taken advantage of Mexican generosity and forbearance, both by establishing slavery in contravention of Mexican policy and by speculating in Mexican lands. Lundy's polemic, and if you haven't read it, I urge you to read it. It still reigns, there's still a power there, a rhetorical power. Not all of it is true. In retrospect, we can say he did make some mistakes, but it's important to re-encounter the things that Lundy and other people like him had to say and understand some of the force behind the arguments that they put forth. His message was plain. A desire to reestablish the system of slavery was a prominent motive with the Texans for resisting the consolidation of the government of the Mexican states, and that even if that change had not been attempted, they would soon have declared themselves independent of the Mexican Republic. A direct quote, this is by the picture of Lundy. The immediate cause and the leading object of this contest originated in a settled design among the slaveholders of this country to wrest the large and valuable territory of Texas from the Mexican Republic in order to reestablish the system of slavery, to open a vast and profitable slave market therein, and ultimately to annex it to the United States. We now have the hindsight of history, and we can actually try to investigate whether these things took place. Some of them did. Texans opposed centralization for the same reason that their United States counterparts had espoused nullification in states' rights, that is to safeguard slavery. Oppression, Lundy insisted, had never been felt by the Texans, but the profits to be realized from slavery and land speculation remained a constant attraction for them. It's important to emphasize that Lundy was not writing from a scholar's salon in Philadelphia or New York. Lundy actually spent considerable time in Texas, and he talks about this in the pamphlet and the other things that he wrote. Now, let's sort of, talk a little bit more about what he was talking about here. He was not talking about people who were abiding by the rules of the game, so to speak, okay? He said he was not talking about the class of Texans working as farmers and ranchers who were willing to work alongside their Mexican neighbors and who did so by their own hand or with free labor. Lundy, like Almonte, admired such people. He, in fact, tried to join them, but it didn't succeed. He certainly would have been one of the more unique impresarios in Texas had he succeeded in establishing his colony of free blacks near Corpus Christi. It would have been, things would have turned out a little bit different, I think. But he was too late by that point. When he came here, and by the time he applied for this, it wasn't going to happen. You're probably familiar with this. 3 years ago, Jack Jackson came and talked about this. Almonte and Lundy corresponded extensively. I would even say that they were friends. And Almonte essentially shared Lundy's position on the role of slavery in Texas and said so on numerous occasions. Exposure to the growing abolitionist movement in the United States also convinced Almonte that half measures on the part of Mexico would never result in emancipation for slaves, that the Anglo-colonists held in bondage. The rich slaveholding class would always manage to circumvent the laws one way or another. And I'm not going to go into how that happened. I think we all know about how the various responses by the Texas colonists to circumvent slavery, putting them on 99-year contracts, basically avoiding essentially legal subterfuge. Further, it was clear that the big land investors who were wining and dining him during his visit were motivated solely by profit, just as Lundy said. At this point, by the way, in Jackson's narrative, Almonte still somewhat had an open mind, but at a famous meeting that he had, he pretty much was able to see that Lundy and his characterization of the Texans was correct. Now, what have some people said about this issue? I said earlier in my talk that I was going to talk a little bit about what historical narratives have said. This is from documents of Texas history. And I mean, the long and short of this slide is essentially to say this. I don't think contemporary, and certainly earlier in the, let's say 1930s, 40s, 50s scholars of Texas have taken on what Lundy and the abolitionists had to say. It's always this Texas defense. Well, you're not from Texas, so you couldn't possibly know what happened down here. I mean, these are sort of ad hominem attacks that don't actually take on the argument, that don't actually provide rebuttals to what the man actually said. So, for instance, Manifest Destiny conspiracy theories. I mean, this is a very famous poster. It's pretty fascinating that the Texans themselves could put forth things like this in northern newspapers and in New Orleans, recruiting people for the Texas cause, and say that Santa Anna was trying to enslave them while they were trying to put forth a revolution whose purpose was to enslave black people. That's hypocrisy, and it's the same thing that characterizes the American Revolution, and it's something from which the Texas Revolution is not exempt. In terms of the Stenberg thesis, I'll leave that for another day. I think his dissertation is certainly interesting, but it doesn't really matter. A lot of people have dismissed some of this historiography with the broad brushstroke of, well, it's just, it's a conspiracy theory. I think in Texas historiography, that you say the two words conspiracy theory, as if, and then you actually want to have a conversation beyond that and try to delve a little bit deeper into the meaning of some of these things. And usually what's behind the label is, you start getting into minutiae. But I mean, I think there's no undoing the fact that the Texas Revolution was a revolution that was premised on a lot of things. One of them meant enslavement for a significant portion of the population. Now, I did put in some stuff here, in response to the conspiracy theory analysis about the fact that most of the people who fought at San Jacinto, certainly a good portion, were Americans. They were not Texans. I think that's not a surprise to anybody. This is a little arrow about the propaganda campaign. Some stuff over here about the Independence Convention in Washington. How many people who were there who were native Texans, who were Tejanos. I mean, when you look at Samuel Price Carson, who was, became Secretary of State, I mean, this is a man who'd been in Texas for a week. I mean, come on, So these are not people who had a long invested interest in Texas, okay? They were Americans. Oh, let's do some analysis. A little philosophical analysis. Life, liberty, and property. Something that's mentioned in the American Constitution. Of course, the language is different from the American Declaration of Independence, which says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But by 1836, it became all about life, liberty, and property. So what does this thing, property, mean in the context of a slaveholding society? When the primary material investment that slaveholders had was not in real estate, but in slaves. What does that mean? Well, let's talk about it a little bit. Justice and property, from this philosophical perspective, are identical. You cannot have rights that are independent of property rights. It's an interesting variation of a classical liberal, or in contemporary terms, libertarian ideal. The single largest property right thought to be vital to the future economic development of Texas was, of course, slavery, and the idea of slavery's continued expansion. Land speculation figured in this to the extent that northern real estate investors wished to ensure legal stability, and southern speculators wanted land to farm. Many of the Texas settlers, especially the more recent ones, saw Texas as an entrepreneurial opportunity to escape debt or imprisonment back in the United States, not a surprise, and understood slavery to be the cornerstone of their hopes, regardless of whatever personal feelings they might have had on the subject. This was especially true of Northerners, who established themselves in Texas as lawyers, merchants, and politicians. And I'll get into that in a minute, who some of these people were. Their business connections and expertise were important. They helped to further integrate Texas into the Union. The suspension of the Mexican Constitution, Mexican tyranny, or Mexican conspiracies to enslave the Anglo-colonists of Texas were important issues, but they were secondary issues that were often used as excuses or pretexts. The material interests at stake were the primary reason for the conflict. This was something that was actually mentioned at the meeting in San Antonio last month. Somebody, I can't remember who it was, who talked about the Southern character and about how Southerners are not sort of ideologues. They make decisions based upon where they feel in their gut. And this is just a variant of that thesis. Now, the question of centralism versus federalism. I think it was understood, certainly by 1835, that no matter what Mexican government was going to be established, a federalist one or a centralist government, that slavery was not going to be allowed to continue. Maybe not immediate abolition, but certainly a movement towards eventual abolition. Henry Adams talked about this in 1882. Henry Adams, of course, being the son of John Quincy Adams. And he talked about the role of nullification, states' rights. States' rights is something that still has a powerful hold, I think, on the American imagination, certainly certain sections of it. What do states' rights mean? Well, states' rights can't be explained outside of slavery. It's impossible. I don't know how anybody can. And whenever it was invoked, and it was almost always invoked by defenders of slavery. People from the North did not invoke states' rights except in reaction to the South, okay? It was always about the issue of slavery. Now, I did promise a little discussion of some people from the North who came to Texas, and I have to say this as a guy, who's sort of a Northerner, but who has Southern roots. Charles Morgan, a very famous person from New York who helped establish regular steamship service into Texas. This is obviously the Yellowstone here, and some discussion of what Morgan did in terms of opening up Texas to regular trade. He and Rice, William Marsh Rice, are important political figures in the history of Texas. That requires me to go into a little bit about the history of slavery and slave trading in Texas in the 1820s and 30s. I don't have the time to do that. But just, this, by the way, will be on my website eventually, and you can look at some of the sources that I'll post there. But basically, for now, just take my word. Charles Morgan and William Marsh Rice were deeply implicated in slavery and slave trading, okay?
Perhaps this is not the best time for a Rice graduate to tell you this, but this is your 2-minute warning.
Oh, boy.
Which according to the Pomeroy precedent means you have no more than 4 or 5 more minutes.
Okay, good. I'll hurry up then. There we go. A.C. Horton. This is a picture of Governor Horton from the Capitol building. Horton is a wonderful case study. His picture is, I think, the 3rd picture in the Capitol Rotunda if you go up there. You know, one of the things, this is just a background. I'll move right along. Basically, this is all about his slave trading activity, okay? This is the SS Texas Slave Ship Manifest. This is a ship manifest signed by Horton on the bottom of 59 souls that he purchased in Charleston from the noted Charleston slave trader Ziba Oaks, okay? You can see here down here who the people were, the signatories. This is in 1859. This is the actual bill of sale and mortgage that he took out. He mortgaged a portion of his plantation to make this purchase. This is another, this is an actual Morgan Steamship Line slave ship manifest of some people that were brought to Galveston from New Orleans. This is some discussion from Daly's book about the domestic slave trade. These are some advertisements, by the way, from Texas newspapers regarding slave trading. This is, of course, Edward Riordan, and this is William Marsh Rice and Company. And, of course, the infamous Sidners, who I think even conventional Texas historians admit were the most noted slave auctioneers in Texas. This is actually a picture of an auction that they had in 1867 after the emancipation. In terms of the abolitionist argument, I have here another quote from Vasquez. Slavery in Texas Economics. This is Hamilton Stewart, collector of customs at Galveston and publisher of the Civilian and Galveston City Gazette, where he admits pretty much the role of slavery in Texas and its importance to the people of Texas, by the people being defined as white men. Frederick Merck from 1972. The explanation of the Texas Revolution, that it was an uprising against Mexican tyranny, is unfounded. That explanation was propaganda spread by the Texans in the course of the war. The Mexican administration of Texas had been weak and vacillating. The central government had been disorderly, and provincial government of Coahuila, Texas, had been corrupt. But even Texan historians are now agreed that Mexican rule had not been cruel or oppressive. The revolution was basically the outcome of admitting into the rich prairies of Texas a race of aggressive and unruly American frontiersmen, blah, 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 blah. I don't necessarily agree with the language, but some of the points I think are valid. Now, in terms of the Texan Revolution, how revolutionary, I did want to just have, this is like 2 or 3 slides from the end. When you compare the Texas Revolution with other revolutions, let's say the French Revolution or the Haitian one or the revolutions in Europe of 1848, you know, it's a debate that continues. I don't know exactly how revolutionary Texas was. Certainly, if you want to judge a revolution by the degree to which the rich and powerful were overthrown by the poor and working classes, that's not what characterizes the Texas Revolution. Matter of fact, the opposite took place. On presentism, I do want to talk about this because what does it mean to be a presentist historian or a person who has a perspective on some of these things? Collingwood is famous for having said that history, every generation has its own history, every epoch. Every generation defines its own history by its own epoch, okay? And now presentism, by a lot of people, is thought to be a bad thing. The idea here is that you have a duty as a historian to not bring your own morality, your own political perspective to the historical material. Your job is to see them, these historical actors, exactly as they saw it, okay? You are not to inject, you are not to retroactively sort of cast judgment because these people at the time do not have the benefit of hindsight. Collingwood obviously said something different, as did Kissinger, of course, during the Vietnam War. But von Ranke, Leopold von Ranke, who pretty much was an establisher of the school of scientific historiography, said in the late 19th century, history is facts. That's it. History is facts. And where do you get those facts? You get those facts from documents. And where do you get those documents? You get them from the Prussian government. Okay? Fast forward to today. Okay, Kissinger pretty much said the same thing about Vietnam. Well, what's going on over there, Mr. Kissinger? Well, what's going on over there is what we tell you is what's going on. Okay? And then, of course, people started coming back and writing their own narratives, and oral historians started talking about what was actually going on in Vietnam. And, people like Kissinger and von Ranke really started getting agitated. Okay? The truth is that if you analyze a society using a non-presentist approach, the way you analyze a slaveholding society is from the standpoint of the slaveholders. I mean, who do you think wrote these documents that you're looking at? Okay? The same is true of Nazi Germany. If your job is to avoid feeling and to only see it the way the Germans saw it, you're going to look at it like a person who's committing genocide. Okay? That's the point of that. I'm almost done. My last quote. The places that commemorate sad history are not places in which we wallow in remorse, but instead places in which we may be moved to a new resolve to be better citizens. Explaining history from a variety of angles makes it not only more interesting, but also more true. When it is more true, more people come to feel that they have a part in it. That is where patriotism and loyalty intersect with truth. Thank you very much for your kind attention and for your patience.
Well, it's time for lunch, and please, we're running a little late, so our lunchroom is at the Shamrock, which is in the back to the left. And did you want to say another word?
Just remind people when they come, when we're coming back.
Yeah, we're coming back here at 2 o'clock.
Let me say a couple of things. We've got two historians of the Texas Rangers and Indian Wars talking about that field with the Texas Revolution. So please come back at 2 o'clock and hear Professor Anderson and Stephen Moore. Thank you.